Now let's just move on further toward another representation or graphical representation of data, which is nothing but called as the frequency polygon. So what is actually a frequency polygon? So this is another visual way of representing quantitative data and its frequencies, and this is a type of, or we can say this is a polygon. So let us suppose if I'm just talking about how we can form a frequency polygon. So for that, first of all, we have to construct a histogram. So let us suppose if I'm just taking the previous example, and I'm just taking the histogram of the previous example. So let us suppose if I'm just taking the histogram of the weights and the number of the students example. So now how we can construct the histogram, how we can construct the frequency polygon for this particular histogram. So always remember, in order to form a frequency polygon, the very first step which is involved with this is to create a histogram. So I have already created a histogram because we already are aware about that how we have constructed this histogram. Now the second step would be like, we have to look out for the midpoints. Yes, midpoints of all these rectangles, or we can say that all these classes. We have to look out for the midpoint of all these. Moreover, we have to do two extra steps over here. Since we are starting from the interval 30.5 to 35.5, we also have to look for the midpoint of its preceding class and that of the succeeding class at the end. Means what I'm talking about over here, that since we know that the classes are actually starting from 30.5 to 35.5, but I also have to look out for the midpoint of the class interval, that is 25.5 and to 30.5, which is actually a class preceding this one. So let us suppose if I'm just taking the midpoint of this particular class interval as nothing but this point, which is nothing but A, and let us suppose if I'm taking the midpoint of this particular class interval as nothing but this point. So I have to join all these midpoints with a particular line. So let us suppose if I'm just joining the midpoint A with this midpoint and I'm calling it as nothing but B. Similarly, I'm taking any midpoint over here which is nothing but C, and I'm joining B with the C as this, and further I'm taking any point D over here, means the midpoint over here, and I'm again joining it with D, and further I'm taking E, and further I'm taking the midpoint as F, and further I'm taking the midpoint as nothing but G, and further I'm taking the midpoint of the succeeding class, which is 60.5 to 65.5. So this dotted line that I'm getting over here is actually nothing but a frequency polygon. This is nothing but called as the frequency polygon. So this is the way how we can represent the data into the formation of a frequency polygon. So let's just move on further towards another example. So let's just form the frequency polygon for an example. It says, consider the marks out of 100 obtained by 51 students of a class in a test. So this is nothing but the representation which is given to us. So we have to draw its frequency polygon. So its question says, draw a frequency polygon corresponding to this frequency distribution table. So let's just see how we can form it. So first of all, we have to draw the histogram from this data and mark the midpoints of the tops. So this is the very first step which is involved with it. The second step would be like, find the class preceding 0 to 10. We extend the horizontal axis in the negative direction and find the midpoint of the class, and similarly the midpoint of the class succeeding the last class of the given data. Means we always have to look for the midpoint of the class which is actually starting from the very first class, and we also have to look out for the midpoint of the class which is succeeding the last class. So here we are actually starting from the class interval 0 to 10. So we'll look out for the midpoint of the class interval from we have minus 10 to 0. So let us suppose if I'm just drawing the histogram over here. Now you can see over here I'm also taking this previous class as well, that is nothing but this minus 10 to 0, 0 to 10. I'm taking this one, I'm considering this previous class as well, and furthermore I'm considering this class as well. Now let us suppose if I'm just drawing the histogram. First of all, we all know how we can able to draw the histogram from 0 to 10. We have the frequency as this and further this. So this is the way how we can create the histogram. Now let's just talk about the midpoints of all of these. So we are starting with the very first midpoint. So I'm taking the midpoint of minus 10 to 0 as this particular point. I'm taking the midpoint of this as nothing but this particular point, and then I'm just joining joining these 2 points together. So this A point was actually this point A. So this A point was actually this point A. I'm joining A and B since they are both the midpoints, and further I'm joining it with this point, which is nothing but the midpoint C for this class interval. Further I'm joining this with this midpoint, which is D, and further with this E, and further with this F, and further with this G, and further with this H, and further I'm joining this with I, and further I'm joining this with J, and further I'm joining this with K, and further we have to join this K with another class over here as well. So this is nothing but actually the frequency polygon for this particular example. So we also have to join K with the other class over here as well. We always have to join the midpoints, the succeeding class, so we can say the midpoint of the succeeding class of the last class. We also have to join this K with another class. So let us suppose if this is the way I'm joining and I'm calling it as any particular point, you can take it as any particular point, S, L, you can take it as any particular point. So these are the actually points which are representing the midpoints of all these rectangular bars. Now let's just move on further. Let us suppose if I'm just taking it as L, so this is the frequency polygon, and so hence what we can say about the frequency polygon that we are getting, frequency polygons can also be drawn independently without drawing the histogram. So actually rather than only just rather than drawing a histogram first, we can also create a frequency polygon independently without the histogram. So for that we have to do a particular kind of a step which involves, for this we require the midpoints of the class intervals that are used in the data, and these midpoints of the class intervals are actually called as the class mark. It means we have to look out for the class mark first of all. So the class mark is actually obtained by upper limit plus lower limit divided by 2. So let's just see how we can how we can form a frequency polygon independently without drawing a histogram. Let's just see an example for it. Let us suppose if I'm taking this example, it says in a city the weekly observation made in study on the cost of living index are given as this. So this is nothing but a question which is given to me. Now it says we just have to draw a frequency polygon independently. We have to draw the frequency polygon independently for this particular question. So for this we definitely have to find out the class marks, because without the class marks we cannot draw the frequency polygon independently. So the question says draw a frequency polygon for the data above without constructing a histogram. So first of all, for that we have to construct the class marks. So let us suppose if I'm extending this table over here, I'm just constructing the class mark. So we know that how we can construct the class mark. Class mark is actually nothing but upper limit plus lower limit divided by 2. So if I'm just talking about the very first, so this is nothing but 140 plus 150 divided by 2. So this is nothing but of this form. So let's just sort it out. This would be nothing but 290. This is 290 divided by 2. So hence let's just take this as, this is 2 into 1 is 2, 2 into 4 is 8, and then we have 2 into 5 is 10, means 145 is actually nothing but the class mark, or the midpoint, or I can say the midpoint of the class mark of this particular 140 to 150. Now further again we can find out the class mark of the 150 to 160 class intervals. This would be 150 plus 160 divided by 2, which is nothing but definitely is equal to 310 divided by 2. So this is nothing but 2 into 1 is 2, 2 into 1 is 2, and further we have 2 into 5 is 10 and 2 into 5 is 10. So this is 155, and in the similar manner we can also find the class mark for this one, means 160 plus 170 divided by 2, and this would comes out to be is equal to 165. In the similar manner we can construct the class mark for this one. This would comes out to be 175, 185, further we have 195, and so goes on. So these are actually nothing but representing the class marks, and using this class mark we can able to construct the frequency polygon. So let us suppose if I'm just completing this table. So this is the table that I have actually formed over here. Now using this table I can construct the frequency polygon. Always remember, if I'm just talking about the midpoints, so the midpoints are actually nothing but the class marks. If I'm just saying midpoint, so midpoint means I'm just talking about the class marks, not anything else. So this is nothing but the class marks. Now using these class marks and using the cost of the living index, let's just see how we can draw a frequency polygon. Now let's just see the frequency polygon. First of all, I'm just taking the cost of living index over here, the number of the weeks over here, and since we know that we always have to look out for the class mark of the preceding class as well as that of the succeeding class, since it is always definitely not given to us in the question, so we always have to look out for ourselves. So now since we know that the classes were actually starting from 145 to 155, so its preceding class is 135 to 145 and the succeeding class is 205 to 215 and so goes on. So let us suppose if I'm just starting with the class mark, so since we know that the very first class mark that we have is nothing but 145, and along with the class mark 145 we have the frequency as nothing but 5. And now for the previous one, if the frequency or if the class mark of the class is the very first is nothing but 145, so for the previous one the class mark should be nothing but of the form 135, should be of the 135. Now let us suppose if I'm just plotting the points as the class mark comma their frequency. So since we do not know about the frequency of the previous class, so we are taking it as 0. So the very first point should start from this, which is actually representing the coordinates as 135, 0. So A is actually 135, 0. So this is nothing but 135 is nothing but the class mark and 0 is nothing but its corresponding frequency. And the second one is the point B, which is actually representing 145 class mark along with its corresponding frequency, which is nothing but 5. Now the further point is C, and C point is representing the coordinate which is 155 class mark along with its frequency as nothing but 10. And further we have the point D. The D point is actually representing the class mark which is 165 along with its corresponding frequency, which is nothing but 20. It is nothing but 20. And furthermore, if I'm just moving on further towards the point E, so this point E is actually representing the class mark 175 correspond to its frequency, which is nothing but 9. And further we have the next point, which is nothing but F, so this is representing 185, 6. And further we have this G, which is nothing but representing 195, 2. And further we have this as the last, means this wasn't the last class mark, because the last class mark was is nothing but 195 as per the question, and this was the class mark for the class which is succeeding the last class. So this was actually the last class which was given to us. This wasn't the last class, this was the last class which was given to us. So this is the class that we have taken, means we always have to take the class mark of the class which is succeeding the last class, which is nothing but 205. So this is nothing but a point which is representing, let us suppose if I'm calling it as H, and this is nothing but representing a class mark 205, and obviously the frequency has nothing but 0. So this is nothing but the way we can represent a frequency polygon. So after joining all these points, means after joining the point A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, we get such a type of we can say a figure. So this is nothing but called as, such a type of polygon is nothing but called as a frequency polygon. So without a histogram, we actually have obtained a frequency polygon through this particular step.